Prime Minister Justin Trudeau released an almost 7-minute-long YouTube video this weekend diving into the government's recent changes to immigration. In the video, Trudeau says some bad actors took advantage of post-pandemic immigration programs that brought in workers, and his government didn't act fast enough to stop them.
Looking back, when the post-pandemic boom cooled and businesses no longer needed the additional labour help, as a federal team, we could have acted quicker and turned off the taps faster.
Today, Conservative Leader Pierre Poilievre said the Prime Minister is shifting blame rather than taking accountability for his own actions.
If the Prime Minister is hunting for the quote-unquote bad actors who ruined the system, will he have a look in the mirror?
Let's bring in the power panel. Cheryl Oates is former Director of Communications for Rachel Notley, and here with me in studio is Vandana Cutter, a former advisor to Prime Minister Trudeau. Lisa Raitt is a former Conservative Cabinet Minister, and Rob Russo is the former CBC Parliamentary Bureau Chief and my boss, and now the Canada correspondent for The Economist.
Nobody was your boss, Jim. You were incorrigible.
That's still the case, yep. Lisa, what do you make of this 7-minute mea culpa from the Prime Minister? I mean, essentially laying it all on the table that they messed this up, that they didn't do well on immigration.
So from 30,000 feet, I'm just going to say that if anyone tries to do a 7-minute video on TikTok, I immediately unfollow them, because I don't want to listen for 7 minutes to the explanation, quite frankly. So from a communications point of view, it's a bit risky. No one's going to listen to the whole thing. I really don't think anyone, except for maybe the Conservatives who are writing the oppo on it, will listen to the whole thing and piece it apart. So interesting choice to get it out there. And in terms of, he wants to frame it up, obviously, they are concerned about the impact it's going to have on them and their electoral futures, and they want to get an explanation out there. And they decided that their best communicator is the Prime Minister, and he's the one who's gone out to bring the message to the masses on this one. I think, you know, the Conservatives acted really quickly on it, and it's a tough one to explain because there's a lot of different layers of a lot of things that went wrong at the same time that caused the situation we're in right now.
Yeah. Vandana, I mean, it's a pretty frank video. I mean, it's kind of an acknowledgement that they got things wrong. They let too many people in. They let the temporary immigration programs kind of spiral out of control. But to Poilievre's point, he kind of frames it as if it's bad actors, greedy corporations, schools that had fraudulent degrees. Like, there's an acknowledgement that the government did something wrong, but also sort of passing the buck, really, at the end of the day. What do you make of this whole communications exercise that we're seeing?
I think it's really interesting, and to Lisa's point, I actually originally would have agreed that it's too long, I would flip something. But that being said, when I looked at the views, this YouTube view had 500,000 people viewers so far, and that's when I looked at it at like around 1 o'clock. The last most viewed video was from the PM, also on YouTube for 37,000. So it is effective, it is working. I've kind of seen other videos from him on Instagram and TikTok, and people aren't viewing it. So it tells me that people are looking to YouTube more often. So it is something that is, you know, maybe it's not for me, but other people have been seeing it. On what it is, I think people like, and who does this really well is actually Doug Ford, when leaders are authentic and admit mistake. And I've seen him do it, people accept it. I think it's also, Canadians don't want to hear you talking at them, and they want to hear like, I'm human, this happened, here's why it happened. I think that immigration was a file that I was very close to. I have seen those bad actors. I've even seen them from family members of mine who said, hey, I went to a consultant, he told me to do this. And I'm like, don't do that. Yeah. That's a bad idea. You can't just, no one can just stay here. So it is a problem. I've seen with private colleges, one of the biggest public colleges that got the most amount of international students was Conestoga. So these are actual realistic things, and I think the problem is the PM has been the face, but people do want to hear, and if people are watching it, they may want to hear what exactly happened to this. So it shows there's an appetite, but a very interesting communication strategy.
Yeah, Cheryl, I mean, from what I know about at CBC, that longer things do better on YouTube. I mean, that's kind of counterintuitive, but like there's kind of this appetite for long explanations on YouTube for whatever reason. People like to watch things at length, and really this is kind of cribbing from Pierre Poilievre in a way, isn't it? Because he kind of pioneered this thing in Canada of doing these kind of lengthy, I don't really want to call them documentaries, but kind of these like deep dives into issues, and he's had some success with it. Is that what we're seeing here, just Trudeau emulating Poilievre?
I think it's a couple of things. One is certainly it's working for the Conservatives, and there is an appetite for long form content, certainly in a way that didn't exist a decade ago. It used to be the saying that if you're explaining, you're losing. And it seems like that might kind of be the opposite now. Like, people are actually looking for explanations. They're staying on the algorithms on social media sites, and even content platforms themselves are now promoting longer form content. So I think this is a smart move on behalf of Trudeau to even try to compete with Pierre Poilievre's long form videos. I think there are some compelling pieces of his video. And I also think that every time he posts something like this, and every time, even if it gets 10,000 views or 5,000 views, it is the Liberals starting to build an online community of people that are subscribing to their channels, that are regularly following their channels, that are seeing their next round of content. And that is gold in this political campaigning era. It's a way to reach people that so far only the Conservatives have been doing.
Yeah, Rob, it's also a bit of like earned media, right? Because the Liberals haven't been advertising at all, right? They spent like $300,000 last year compared to millions for the Conservatives. And we're talking about this tonight. We're talking about some of the Liberal solutions. Like maybe that's one strategy too that they thought about when putting this video out, is that like, this is a way to reach people and we don't have to spend $1 on it, right?
Perhaps, yeah. I'd like to see if they were going to be competitive. If I were a Liberal, I would be interested in them spending a few dollars and showing up on a football game with a commercial or something like that. Look, I thought it was interesting and revelatory of a few things. First of all, it was the Prime Minister himself who was doing the discussion. Okay, again, we often talk at the parlor game in this town as to whether or not he's going to stay. This is a man who decided to put himself in front of the camera and say, "I got this wrong." And so, as a reporter, I always think that instead of jumping on people, politicians, when they admit that they made mistakes, which is a totally normal thing to do, I think in some ways it should be applauded. But as I used to say to my kids, there should never be a subordinate clause after an apology. There should never be, yeah, but it, just stop at the apology part, and I think it's more effective. It isn't false, though, to say that premiers and CEOs were screaming at him to bring more people in because there was a labor shortage, but the federal government is responsible for immigration. And so one of the reasons why Mark Miller, the immigration minister, is popular with the reporters is that he pays us a compliment of being blunt. He'll say, and what did he say? It's a bit of a mess, is what he said. And that's effective. I think that that's an effective communication. Yes, it leaves you open to attack, but if you're going to solve the problem, acknowledge the problem. So length was interesting. The PM in front of the camera was interesting. I know we're going to talk about the Conservative response ad to that on Instagram, a different platform, shorter, and a little bit more shock and awe as opposed to a lengthy kind of discourse and explanation walking through it. I thought that the contrast between the two was very interesting.
Yeah, and maybe more authentic too, right? Because there's a lot of people yearning for authenticity in politics. You know, if we're to believe some of the exit polls out of the U.S., that people liked Trump's frankness and his freewheeling and his free dealing, and that kind of had some appeal to people. And maybe there's a recognition here in Canada that they need to be a little more forthright.
Sincerity, you've got it made in politics.
Right. Lisa, on the larger issue of immigration, I mean, we are seeing some really startling numbers that are coming out of polls about how Canadians feel about immigration. I was just looking today at Abacus. Half of Canadians say immigration is ruining the country. So it's not just that they're concerned about it, but that it's ruining the country. And Leger recent poll, 2/3 of Canadians say immigration levels are too high. Has this government really done a number on the Canadian consensus? What was a Canadian consensus about accepting more people in this country?
Well, I think their policies led to this surge in immigration that came in through the back door and remains. And when you hear stories about CBSA officers giving advice at the border saying, no, don't do this, come in this way in order to be able to elongate your stay, we have a real problem. I think the biggest complaint that I have about this government is that they were so quiet for so long. They must have known. There must have been briefings coming up through the bureaucracy. They're very professional people that work here in Ottawa. They should have seen it. The university should have seen it. You saw it in Cape Breton, where I'm from, where the university ended up having such an incredible growth spurt that there was no housing left. And that was a microcosm of what happened in the rest of the country. The impacts are real, for sure. People are feeling it in terms of housing, and they're feeling it in terms of little day-to-day things, such as whether or not you're going to have health care. And they're going to blame it on whether or not there's too many people coming into the country. I don't think it's unsalvageable, though. I still think that fundamentally we do believe that this is an important part of the Canadian identity, to have immigration that makes sense in order to help build and grow our country. I don't think it's completely, baby out with the bathwater, completely gone. But listen, I mean, in terms of what Trudeau said today, I think where in there did he talk about the fact that when Pierre Poilievre tried to bring it up 2 years ago that there was a problem, that he was called a racist? Where's that apology? Because I don't see it in there. And it's like this, I suddenly have realized that I made a mistake, therefore you must forgive me. Let's remember all the things that you said about other people who try to bring it to your attention. I think that's valid.
Yeah. Vandana, what do you make of that point? But also, do you worry about the consensus crumbling? Like, this is probably going to be an election issue whenever we have the next election, right? Immigration. And I can't remember really this ever being much of an election issue in at least the last 20 years or so where I've been following politics closely. Like, I don't really remember this coming up. Like, it was just kind of something that they didn't touch. And yet, Poilievre's probably going to hammer Trudeau in the next campaign on this issue.
Yeah.
Does that worry you?
I think the worries about immigration overall and where there has been racial undertone, I don't think it's just from white people. My own community is making racial undertones on immigrants, right? So I do worry about that. I do think immigrants are being scapegoated for a lot of the issues: inflation, lack of housing, healthcare, a lot of inequities happening in the system, and the system hasn't been able to support them. Immigration, having worked those files, they're very messy. There is not one path, there's many, and a lot of things are coming at you at once. I remember, Ukraine happening, but we also had Afghan refugees at the same time. So there's a lot of things that need to be streamlined, and I think they're working on that. Do I think Pierre Poilievre is going to take this on? I think I've been listening to him as well as Jasraj Halong and Tim Uppal on multicultural media in Punjabi radio, and they haven't been anti-immigrant. What they've really been saying is immigration has been a problem. We need to fix it. They've been very careful not to hit on the anti-immigrant undertones. So I don't think he'll attack them. So I don't think, to Lisa's point, I don't think you can call him a racist. But I do think immigration, maybe depending when the election is, I'm not sure if this does show to be effective. I think it can fall off the radar. I think, to Lisa's point, this is something that isn't really part of Canada's psyche. But if it comes sooner than later, or people are still feeling problems, or you're still feeling that immigrants are being scapegoated because of these other issues, then yes.
Yeah, and Cheryl, it's kind of a different electoral map in Canada than in the United States. I mean, you can't just win power in this country by appealing to certain demographic groups, right? You have to have broad appeal, right? And some of the seats, for example, in the 905 or in suburban Vancouver or even in Alberta, there's very diverse voting groups there, right? So you can't really take a similar track as maybe some other right-wing politicians in other countries.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that, we've all been talking about is in places like, at least where I'm sitting on the prairies, in places like BC, in places like Alberta and in Saskatchewan, the issues, these aren't the number one issues in these provinces. This is not what people are talking about around their kitchen tables. They're talking about, in Vancouver, can we make housing more affordable? Can we accelerate housing construction? And we know that the construction industry is just begging for temporary foreign workers. And so finding a way to, square that circle and say, we're going to continue to support the housing industry while also making blanket cuts is a tough message to send to Vancouver. Same thing in, Alberta and Saskatchewan, where healthcare is an issue. If we're going to cut the number of people coming into Canada, how are we going to continue to support those things that are top of mind, that people are talking about around the kitchen tables? Yeah,
Rob, final thoughts to you?
I think Charles is absolutely right. There are carve-outs, though, for those in the housing industry and the healthcare industry. Look, I think it's one of the great things about the country in that immigration helped build us, and the consensus is framed, but none of the politicians are attacking the immigrants or blaming immigration for the woes. And that's not the case in most countries in Europe, most Western democracies. We are seeing a nativist wave that's cresting in Europe and in the United States. I think it says good things about Canada that that's not happening. That being said, we should expect almost or more than a halving of permanent new residents if Pierre Poilievre is to be believed. He said he's going to tie it to housing starts. Annual starts of housing last year were 219,000. 219,000. We have about 475,000 new immigrants scheduled to come here. well, that's more than half, and that will have an economic impact.
Which is back to what he says is like the Harper level, right? And that was something that the country could handle. Okay, Conservative Leader Pierre Poilievre released a video on social media this weekend going after what he calls the woke, weird, wacko world of Justin Trudeau.
Too woke? Hey, Pierre Poilievre, it's time for you to wake up.
The video goes on to mention images of Terry Fox and war veterans being removed from the redesigned Canadian passport and shows protesters taking down statues of Prime Minister Sir John A. Macdonald and Queen Victoria. But will this anti-woke message win over Canadians? The Power Panel is back with me, Cheryl Oates, Vandana Cutter, Lisa Ray, and Rob Russo. Vandana, what do you make of this strategy of basically tying Justin Trudeau to everything woke, which I think the definition of woke has like been bastardized at this point. I don't really know what it means, but he's tied him to, you know, kind of going after our history, historical figures, tying him to transgender issues, tying him to like everything, like just trying to put the culture wars on Trudeau and hope that it sticks. What do you make of that approach?
So I think it's very telling for the type of leader he'll be. And from what I saw from the video, I thought it was very divisive. I especially didn't like all the images of kafirs and people who are pro-Palestinian in violence. Now, violence did happen at the protests, but there were also very peaceful protests as well. And I think that further adds to more hate and divisiveness between communities that are having a hard time right now. I think where he's also missing is that how we talk about our history is rich and vibrant, but there doesn't have to be an or. You can approach it with an and. You can teach people like John A. Macdonald, but also teach them about maybe figures that we forgot about, like Indigenous figures, Black figures, women leaders. And a leader will bring that thoughts together for, if this is going to be a debate in this country, how do we put it all together without forgetting the good things that happened as well? And I think that's what I don't like about it. I think it goes on way too negative, but I do think, sadly, it'll be effective to a lot of people.
I actually just did a story on Canadian history knowledge, and it is abysmal, actually, in this country. A recent poll, like, more than 30% of people couldn't identify Sir John A. Macdonald as the first Prime Minister or say when Confederation was in 1867. So people don't necessarily know the good or the bad. Lisa, what do you make of this? I mean, you served with Aaron O'Toole. You know what kind of leader he was. He was maybe more of a moderate force. I spoke to one professor for a story I was working on recently, and he remarked on how O'Toole wasn't that aggressive on these woke issues, right? He condemned bringing down Sir John A. Macdonald statues, but he wasn't all that vocal about it. He didn't make it a centerpiece of his leadership. He didn't say much when the flags were at half-mast on Parliament Hill for months on end after Kelowna, right? He only kind of weighed in during the election campaign. O'Toole was a little reluctant to engage on these issues. Poilievre is not at all. He's going, you know, full tilt boogie on this. What do you make of that shift in strategy?
I think it's a different time, for sure. And I like how, Vandana, how you said that you'd like to see the and. Right, and I agree with you. But there was a point in time in this country when we didn't get the and. Like, it was like you just couldn't talk about whether or not Sir John A. Macdonald did anything good, if there's anything redeeming, or if we should even talk about him at all. But now we're at the and. And it's not a surprise to me, actually, that Pierre and the Conservatives have approached it because it has shown to be popular in the United States. It's definitely something that a cultural group in the United States looks to, like the Rogans of the world, the Dana Whites of the world, the UFC guys, all the stuff that my kids, quite frankly, 20 and 23, follow and listen to. And if he's going to tap into that, he's going to get positive, I would say, reviews from people in the South who have really big microphones and large audiences. And, you know, Joe Rogan saying, I like that Pierre Poilievre guy. That's not necessarily a bad thing for getting people out to vote for him. That video is not meant for Liberal voters. It is not meant for NDP voters. It is meant for people who are thinking about voting for Conservative and voting for him in the next election.
Yeah, Cheryl, I mean, President Trump kind of showed there is some political potency, right, to being anti-woke, anti-political correctness, you know, kind of taking on the progressives and some of their tropes and rhetoric. Like, that was part of his appeal to some people, right? And maybe Poilievre's trying to translate that into the Canadian situation.
I think Pierre Poilievre has tried this. He's tested it. He's shown that it works. This is the kind of content that people like and share online. It's emotive. It is something people get attached to. It's something that people who are in this political world, who are supporting Pierre Poilievre, feel compelled to share. And every time that they share it, and every time someone else looks at it, and every new follower that Pierre Poilievre gets is someone he can now speak directly to. And that is invaluable. Just like we talked about earlier, that's invaluable data for any campaign. And Pierre Poilievre has now been doing it for years. And with every video like this, they train the algorithm, they collect new voters, they collect new data, and they pull people into their message. And if you live in this world where you're watching this video and then the next video that plays is something similar, you start to live in this sort of echo chamber where you believe that everybody agrees with you. And that is only good for the Conservatives.
Yeah, Rob, I mean, Pierre Poilievre got a lot of traction last week when he went after the school principal at a school here in Ottawa for allowing an Arabic song associated with the Gaza conflict to be played during a Remembrance Day ceremony. A lot of people condemned that decision, but Pierre Poilievre, perhaps more than most, went after the principal, saying, you know, he's got to be fired, this is completely unacceptable. Like, Pierre Poilievre kind of likes to engage with these issues, right? He's not afraid, he's not shying away from things that in the past, maybe some politicians might have said, that's a bit too sticky for me, I don't want to go there.
I think that's where we are now in Canada. I think if I looked at the Prime Minister's video, it's he's like that cool dish you pour the hot soup into, okay? Things are bad. I'm not going to show you how bad they are, but they're going to get better. Mr. Poilievre is showing you where we are now. He thinks they're bad, and he's going to show us how bad they are. And there is something there. Canada is more divided now than we used to be. And one of those fault lines is over the way we bring immigrants into our society. My parents were immigrants. They came to Canada, they changed Canada. They left behind old and ancient squabbles. I think you see images in that spot where it's evident that some squabbles are not being left behind, they're being carried on here. And that's a new divide in Canada. That's not the kind of divide we had before. I think that's what he's trying to get at, as well as the fact, I think the Prime Minister has called us the first post-national country. I think that ad is trying to tell us that, no, we believe that there is a Canadian identity, and those toppled statues represent an assault on that identity. So it may seem like a bunch of clips randomly put together, but I actually think there's some very subtle messaging there that gets at the way people are feeling now.
Yeah, Vandana, when I was at the Conservative Policy Convention in Quebec City last year, or fairly recently, one of the biggest reactions that came from the crowd was when they had a British lord come in and just take down the government for removing some of those symbols from the passport. The crowd went, Lisa, I think you were there too, like the crowd was so enthralled with his speech on it and so appalled that the government had stripped those symbols like Terry Fox and Vimy Ridge and some of the landmark figures and historical events of our country out of the passport. So that really riled up the Conservative delegates at this convention. I don't know if it would have the same appeal to everybody across the country, but these people really offended by that move. Do you think there's a risk for Trudeau when it comes to these things, that he does get painted as kind of a fringe minority, who is going after some of the things that a lot of Canadians actually cherish? Is there a political risk for him with all this? I
think we're overstating how much Canadians actually cherish those pieces. Like, I'm also a daughter of immigrants, country that's been colonized and doesn't always see these things the same way, but also accepting that's part of the history here. There are good things and bad things. And I think it's going back to the and. We can teach both things. And I think what we need to give more space for is being more tolerant of all those voices, how to bring them together. To a couple points, one on Lisa's point, I did see a UFC fighter on TikTok, I think at the Bell Centre in Montreal, say everyone needs to vote for Pierre Poilievre, and that was a sold out place, and people shared that. So it was like, he was just won the fight, rough and sweaty. My husband, who's a 46-year-old white male, showed it to me because on his algorithm, not mine. And then to Rob's point, I think the one thing is that if squabbles are not, if they are of the past, if they're happening today, and I think actually a lot of those people who are wearing those keffiyehs, and if we're talking to the Palestinian piece, are not just people from the from Palestinian community. I think it's about war in general, and I think we need to figure out a way how to talk about this. And I think where I agree, Canada is a bit more divided, but how do we have a leader that brings that together? And you saw two contrasting messages here. Again, to Rob's point, the PM was calm, embedded in facts, apologetic, human, and this video was hyperbolic. And a lot of just taking clips of things and foreshadowing that anyone with progressive thought or progressive ideas of how we should evolve and think about our country has gone too far. And I think there's no space for either of that.
Yeah, Lisa, is there a risk there's some sort of backlash? I mean, because it might be politically salient with some people, but other people might be turned off, right? Like Pierre is doing well in the polls now, but if we get closer to an election and Liberals can paint him as this kind of aggressive, like right-wing figure who's more at home with Joe Rogan than he is with normal Canadians, like, is there a risk that there's a backlash to this, that it doesn't quite pay off?
There may be a risk. I don't see it big as a big risk. I would say, though, that what he's also remember, in the construct of all of this is the fact that the Prime Minister has a really bad approval rating. He is not liked in the country, and they're just piling on top of that. I mean, we can get into the intricacies of the woke agenda and what it really means and deep dive into all of the symbolism, but the reality is that he's just making fun of the Prime Minister. He's making fun of him. He's encouraging people to laugh at him, and that really is something that is extremely detrimental to somebody's political career. You can laugh with them, but if you're laughing at them, you got a real problem.
Yeah, Cheryl, how does the Prime Minister and the Liberals respond to something like this? Because it's probably a bit of a trap too, right? Because if you do come out and condemn some of this, if you stand up for protesters pulling down statues or playing songs at Remembrance Day, you yourself could be branded as a bit of an extremist, right?
Yeah, and I think, those folks on the other side, the progressive parties, whether it's the NDP or the Liberals, need to ask themselves before they engage, is this what voters want us to be talking about? Because typically the answer is no. I mean, when you ask people what their priorities are, the things that you just saw in that video, for the majority of Canadians in almost every jurisdiction, those are not the priorities. And the second you get sucked into wedge issues and more polarizing politics, you are not talking about what the majority of voters want to talk about. And we just saw this. If you followed the Saskatchewan election, where Scott Moe came out in mid-campaign after having already done the debate and already rolled his platform out saying policing genders in kids' change rooms will be his number one priority. And because he said it was his number one priority, people didn't like it. The majority of the public pushed back on it, not because they hated the policy, but because they hated that he was making it priority. And so you saw the government pull back and start to campaign on it quietly and strategically rather than in a big air campaign. And what it did for them was they shored up their rural seats and they sacrificed their city seats.
Yeah, we just saw a party in New Brunswick that was very fixated on trans kids go down to defeat to the Liberals, right? That didn't really work out for them necessarily. Rob, final thoughts to you?
I think it's true that that's not germane really to the concerns of people, but I think there is concern in the country about the direction that we're going and our futures and who we are as a people. And I think that all parties, unfortunately, have engaged in divisiveness. Yes, they're pushing on an open door in this ad, and whether or not that's responsible, I think, is a fair question. I keep saying the first leader that brings us all together wins the campaign. If not the election, they win the campaign. And it's a country where we need to be brought together. There are divisions here that weren't here when I started out as a baby reporter, when the Earth's crust was still cooling.
I love that. That's a great image to leave me with. Okay, good. Thank you to the Power Panel, Vandana Khatter, Lisa Ray, Rob Russo, and Cheryl Oates. Thanks so much, guys, for coming.